Hey, Econ kids. This is module 50.2, I guess. 50.1 talked about taxes. This one's talking about, well, what happens when we actually put taxes on here. So, like I said at the end of the last video, no taxes are the best from an economic point of view because everything's perfect with our supply and demand curve. But we also know that, hey, you need some taxes. You could probably get some things paid for by the government easier than if we were buying it ourselves. So what happens with taxes? Taxes are going to do one of two things. It's either going to be a tax on sellers, going to shift the supply curve to the left. A tax on buyers is going to shift the demand curve to the right. So this is a whole bunch of words. You can pause the video and read it, but when we go through it, it's probably easier to describe that way. Okay, this is going to be a $2 tax on a bottle of water. So when you look at this one, okay, all these are going to look kind of the same. And we're always going to draw them the same. That's not how we're going to draw them, sort of like where the supply and demand curve are kind of probably look more almost unit elastic-ish, okay? But it doesn't always work that way due to elasticity. But we're always going to say, here's my supply curve, here's my demand curve, right? Price and quantity here and here. So if this is my way that I'm going to look at the beginning of it, this is just saying, okay, here's my price at equilibrium. Here is my quantity at equilibrium. Okay, I'm going to tax the supplier. It's just easier to do that way. You don't have to add the tax back in afterwards. Okay, if you're a small business owner out there, don't freak out. Okay, we can tax the demander too. What you find is it's exactly the same and it doesn't make a difference. So if we tax the supplier, if this is a $2 tax, what we're going to do is at every point, we're always going to use like flat taxes or excise taxes like on there, not a flat tax, an excise tax, because we want a per unit tax. It's the easiest to measure. Sometimes those are called Pigouvian taxes, okay, per unit. Excise tax, Pigouvian tax. If you go up from your supply, now literally up, now normally we're going to say, supply shifts to the left, but to find it, we have to go up. You have to go up $2, make a point. At this quantity, go up $2, make a point. At this quantity, go up $2, make a point. At this quantity, go up $2, make a point. And you're going to get a new line that is parallel to my supply line because at every point we increased it $2, right? So from here to here, at this quantity, this is going to be $2, okay? And it's going to be $2 every place. So what's going to happen? This is my supply with tax line, okay? Now, what has occurred? I really am seeing a shift to the left of the supply curve. We found it by going up, but we shifted it to the left. That's how it's going to behave, okay? So now what you're going to see is a couple things. This price at equilibrium is now here, which means my price that consumers are going to pay, okay, that's what that PC up there stands for. This is how much you pay. So that's the price on this item. Now, the crazy part, I guess, to some degree, is how much does the seller get, okay? So when you look through this, you're going to see the price that the producer gets here, okay? As you go down to my supply line, because this is the actual supply line where my suppliers are, I'm going to get a price for producers. This is how much producers receive, okay? So there's a wedge jammed in here, just like there was when we did quotas, etc., okay? But this wedge that's jammed in is going to give us tax revenue. How do I find that? I look at the difference between how much consumers are paying, how much the producers are receiving, and this box right here that I'm shading in right now, that is tax revenue. So when we tax a good, we're going to get this tax revenue. And that's where taxes come from, right? Like that's how it works. That's how tax money comes. And you're gonna have this second quantity. Sometimes they say QT for quantity at the tax. Now, as soon as you see this, you're gonna see a couple of things, or you should be noticing a couple of things. The first one is we have a deadweight loss going on. And our deadweight loss is this red triangle, okay? That is a DWL. And that deadweight loss is happening because consumers would be happier without this tax, right? They would get more. Suppliers would be happier without this tax. They could get more. So this is just lost to society. Now, are we going to gain some things by doing this? Sure. You're going to gain some things like maybe you gain new roads, or maybe the bridges get fixed, or whatever it might be. But there is a loss to society that we'll say. That tax revenue might be used in a positive way. If it benefits you, then it's awesome. We are also going to see some reduced consumer surplus. So the reduced consumer surplus is going to be this triangle here. The reduced producer surplus is going to be this triangle here. So we are seeing this cut into our producer and consumer surplus, which is how we can measure who this tax is hitting. So when you look at this graph up here, there's the tax revenue, just like I drew for you, right? You can see it where the supply is, the new supply line going down to the old supply line, square it over, that's your tax revenue. There's your reduced consumer surplus. There's your reduced producer surplus. There's our deadweight loss. So it looks just like the graph I drew, all right? Now, the last part about this is tax incidence, okay? What tax incidence means is that the tax burden is shared. Who is paying which portion? The way we can measure that is by saying, well, how much did you lose in consumer surplus? How much did you lose in producer surplus? So if I'm doing this, I have to sort of erase this square again, okay? So what I do is I go to my equilibrium spot originally, and I come across this top square right here. That is the tax that's paid by the consumer. In terms of consumer, like that's the tax incidence, it's lost consumer surplus. We used to get this whole triangle, that red part, still a deadweight loss. But this top part that I can't get, that portion of the tax, that's on the and paid for by the consumer. The bottom portion of the tax, okay, that's this box down here, that's the part that's paid by the producer. So it doesn't matter. We tax the producer, but the consumer still pays a portion of the tax. If we tax the consumer, the producer will still pay a portion and the consumer will still pay. Everybody's going to pay a portion of the tax. It's going to be shared. Now, if the line's a little more inelastic one way or the other, then somebody might pay more of the tax. If it's perfectly inelastic, we might see somebody paying all of the tax. But it doesn't matter if we tax the producer or the consumer. It works out exactly the same. We always end up in the same spot, and we always end up seeing a tax hitting both parties, okay? There's gonna be a couple tax worksheets that I'm gonna want you to do, and you're just gonna do problems like this. It might make you graph it first, which like they're not gonna make you graph it in probably the AP test. They would just give you the graph itself and then say, okay, what are all these boxes meaning? Right? And then might label the box by area, or they might want you to go like, oh, PC minus PP times QT equals tax revenue, or something like that. Or they might have letters on all the points, and they might make you find an area like that somehow. But that's the kind of questions they're going to give you on tax. It's not as complicated as maybe this graph makes it seem. It probably gets more weird when we start putting in more inelastic or elastic sort of lines. Now, here's a bonus for you. If for some reason we were going to tax the demander, okay, here's the thing. We can get rid of this supply with the tax line here. Okay, this is going to get kind of messy on my board, but we get rid of this supply with tax. What's going to happen though is this demand is now, because we know demanders will only demand, and they're going to get that price that they're paying at the end, right? So this has to be by demand plus the tax, right? With the tax included. So I need to find my demand without the tax. So how do I find that demand without the tax? I have to subtract the tax, go down $2 at every point. I'm going to get a new line right here. So this is my demand without the tax. Well, now you might say, but Mr. Dessler, look, the good's cheaper. We have to add the tax back in because we're finding the good without the tax. So now we're going to go up and over, we're going to find this box is literally in the exact same place. You're still going to pay this much because now you're going to have a cheaper price, yes, but then you're going to have to add the $2 tax back after you buy it. So you're still going to pay up here. The seller is still going to get the price down here. This tax revenue is still going to go to the government, and it's still going to be shared exactly the same way. So it doesn't matter if we tax the supplier or the demander, you're going to end up with the same exact results. And that's the big takeaway. Taxes suck for everybody. Till next time.